Well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Victoria Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of ISCN. A very warm welcome to our special joint session on exploring biodiversity strategies in higher education. We are delighted to be co-hosting this event with our colleagues from Nature Positive Universities and our ISCN Biodiversity Community of Practice. This is a part of an ongoing collaboration between our networks, and this session will explore how universities are developing and implementing biodiversity strategies with examples from recent institutional plans and initiatives. One quick point, if you could please add your university name to your Zoom name, that will help us get to know where everyone is joining us from during the Q&A part of our session. So I really look forward to today's presentations and conversation, and we'll now hand things over to our moderator for the session, to introduce our speakers. So Katrin, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Victoria. Also, warm welcome from my side. My name is Katrin Schweigel. I'm with Freie Universität Berlin, and I'm co-sharing this ISCN Biodiversity Community of Practice together with my colleague, Rebecca Rongstock, who will also be one of the presenters today. So we are very happy and excited to have this joint session with Nature Positive Universities. And as Victoria already said, we are going to look into two very interesting research examples on institutional plans and initiatives. First, we will hear from Rebecca Rongstock from Freie Universität Berlin, who will present key findings from her research on mapping of university biodiversity strategies. And Rebecca is the biodiversity manager at our university, where she collaborated with multiple stakeholders to develop a biodiversity strategy that enhances native urban flora and fauna on campus. And her work bridges biodiversity and conservation research with the planning and management of the university's green spaces and buildings. She's also a doctoral student with a background in biodiversity, evolution, and ecology. And Rebecca's research focuses on the effects of global change on plant and soil ecosystems. So welcome, Rebecca. We will also hear from Emily Stott of NPU from Oxford University, who will share guidance, tools, and global examples from NPU's extensive network, including insights on how biodiversity is integrated into a broader sustainability and climate strategies at different universities. Emily works in the Department of Biology at the University of Oxford and is coordinating the Nature Positive University's global network of universities who have signed up to start a Nature Positive journey in collaboration with UNEP and the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. And Emily developed the Nature Positive Pledge, which has been taken by 135 universities to address the biodiversity impacts of their campuses, operations, and supply chains, sets targets and prioritizes actions for nature. And this is also complemented by an extensive student ambassador program, whereby students around the globe work together to take action for nature on their campuses. So welcome also, Emily, to you. And we will hear about 10 minutes of presentations from both of them, and then we will open the floor for questions. Please let me know via the hand raise symbol or the chat that you have a question, and I will call you up. But now again, a warm welcome to our speakers, Rebecca and Emily. Rebecca, you have the floor.
All right, so I will quickly share my screen. Okay, I hope everything works fine. So I will talk about a classification framework for university strategy papers, which is a mapping that I started before I worked on our university strategy, just to have an Excel sheet next to reading, which helped me a lot. But it turned out to be a small framework with now still preliminary data, but it shows some interesting patterns that I want to show you. But here's a bit of background on university biodiversity strategies. So as we all know, biodiversity is probably a unique characteristic of our planet Earth, And we as humans are, of course, part of this biodiversity, but as well responsible for a major loss of species, genetic variation, and habitats. So protecting and restoring nature is extremely important to build a safe and good life for people on our planet. Most universities are located in urban environments, but in all other ecosystems, there are lots of global change factors that coexist and interact with each other, and these have often unforeseen consequences. So some universities have developed strategy papers, and these include practices for protection and promotion of species that aim to either remove, reduce, mitigate, replace, or modify these various factors of global change. And here I present a framework for classifying these practices. So I found 50 strategies with the help of Emily and NPU by universities that have been used to implement practices. And I captured these and sorted them in impact reduction and biodiversity positive actions. And I will show to you how these practices, their target organisms, and the address global change factors are distributed within the strategies, and ask if biodiversity strategies target the global change factors that are most responsible for biodiversity loss. So there are some limitations to this mapping. As you can see, the 50 strategies are not evenly distributed on a global scale. They are all published on websites in English language, which also, of course, leads to a bias. And what I could also not capture is when biodiversity practices are implemented in a more general sustainability strategies. There's a strong focus of these strategies in the UK, as you can see. So if your university has a strategy that is published, you can also let me know and I will implement it in the mapping. So if we now look at the actions that are done or proposed by these biodiversity strategies, then we can sort them in impact reduction and biodiversity positive strategies. And within the impact reduction section here, we have many studies that focus on to reduce the mowing or remove neophytes or build corridors to reduce habitat fragmentation. There's also biocide and fertilizer bans or reduction in light pollution, soil sealing, or other measures over here. And on the right side, we have the biodiversity positive practices. Most of them are plantings of native plant species. There's also lots of nesting boxes, so a rather artificial way of promoting biodiversity, but it's very popular. And we have roof and facade greening and lots of rather natural habitats that are implemented, like dead woods or ponds, compost, open soil, leaf piles, or rock piles. So those were the most popular actions in the biodiversity strategies. The target organisms I found very interesting. Most of the biodiversity strategies focus on arthropods, but not really on spiders or myriapods or something like that. It's mostly within the insecta. And among them, it's mostly butterflies and bees. So also university strategies choose the most popular target organisms and focus on the most popular ecosystem services, which is pollination. Looks nice, smells good, but there are also other organisms and other ecosystem services or nature contributions to people that are equally important and also mentioned in the practices, like composition, for example, but the organisms are not mentioned. We have plants that are mostly not further specified. The same accounts for birds. And we have mammals, a lot less mentioned, and among them it's most of the time hedgehogs and bats. We have amphibia and reptiles, rarely mentioned, and fungi, fish, and molluscae, each one time mentioned. So there might be a bit of a bias over here. So amphibians, for example, are highly threatened, but there's not really a focus on them when it comes to the target organisms of biodiversity strategies. When we look at the addressed factors of global change, then we do focus on what is the most driver for biodiversity loss. So we have habitat loss and habitat fragmentation. And as well, we have invasive species that are addressed and different kinds of pollutants such as biocides, artificial light at night, and so on and so forth. So in that sense, it seems like we do focus on what harms the most, unlike politics and research as well, that focuses a lot on what will cause a lot of harm, definitely in the future, like climate change. Here, it is probably due to climate mitigation being rather a part of the more general sustainability strategies. Many strategies also have the integration of science as part of their content, which makes perfect sense, I think, because a biodiverse university campus can be used for experiments and observational studies. And some of the strategies also deal with a general promotion of research in that field. And science, of course, is also needed for approving the actions and checking if we actually meet our goals. Some strategies also mention teaching. In that sense, it also makes a lot of sense because the biodiverse campuses can be used for teaching and learning practical methods. And there's frequently also an integration in outreach. So universities can act as role models and use their biodiverse campuses for demonstration and make research results accessible to general public. So we can provide information on which actions are biodiversity loss reducing and biodiversity positive and can be implemented also by people in urban areas. And yeah. Very, very rarely mentioned are living labs because it's a very special approach to deal with the problem of biodiversity loss. It combines research, teaching, and public relations work and brings together employees from science and administration. So it's actually worth thinking about it more. And to conclude, universities are urban microcosms that are built of a smaller community of people and have a variety of green spaces and buildings. So it's a good way to test actions. Here, important context can be made more easily and innovative ideas can be implemented more quickly. For all people from the practical side, I know it's still sometimes hard and it takes long to implement these actions, but it's still, I think, easier than going on a city level, for example. And here, a group of people with a wide range of research interests meets, and we can accumulate this knowledge and we can creatively test it on our campuses. And internal university biodiversity strategies are, of course, not legally binding, but they lead to a productive exchange between science and administration, and it makes it easier to implement these actions. With targeted public relations work, universities can act as role models in dealing with factors of global change and promoting biodiversity. And due to the special networks and fluctuation at universities, people who have ideas or were involved in actions at university campuses can pass them on to society at a larger scale. So what we usually know as something that often makes our lives harder, because this fluctuation, people come and people go, is also maybe a benefit, so to pass knowledge on. So these were my short ideas about biodiversity strategies and the mapping. And
thank you for your input. Yeah, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you. Yeah, again, thanks, and I hand over to Emily.
Hi, does that work? Can you see my screen? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to follow on from Rebecca, and there's a lot of overlap, but also some slightly different framings, which I think actually complement each other really well. It's really great to have this collaboration. I think it's the start of something that we should continue and deepen because there's so much kind of overlap between our initiatives, and also a lot of the same members, you know, both members of NPU and also ISCN. So yeah, thank you for this. Just to briefly introduce NPU and what it is. We were founded around 3 years ago now, building off University of Oxford setting ambitious twin targets for both climate and nature in our sustainability strategy. And I credit that partly to having a vocal biodiversity academic on our working group for our sustainability strategy. And I do recommend that as an approach to getting nature sort of higher profile. So every time climate is mentioned, you have somebody there saying, what about nature? You know, these are two sides of the same coin. So we partnered with United Nations Environment Programme to try to create an inclusive global community of institutions working together to take action for nature, recognizing that it's relatively newer concept idea to think about measurable change for biodiversity, whereas people have thought about measuring carbon and, you know, incrementally improving your contribution. But for biodiversity, I think people haven't thought about how you can actually measure it and what we need to do, what the scale of the challenge is. So that's where we come from. And just a little plug, we would invite anybody in this network that's not already part of NPU to join us, at least to join our mailing list and to learn more about our pledge and to see whether that could work for you. Okay, so firstly, just to reiterate how we define nature positive as a global goal to halt and reverse nature loss. So there's more nature on our planet in the future than there is today. And I often share graphs at this point, sort of showing the declines in biodiversity, which I think is really important and a lot of people don't know. But today I wanted to just celebrate the beauty of nature, because I think this actually is in this kind of emotional reaction actually inspires a lot of us to protect what's so special. And these photos came from a student at University of Lincoln in the UK who has used nature photography, a new hobby of his, to really inspire and connect with students and to bring light to some of the important species that you otherwise wouldn't know about on campus, and to, you know, just a new medium for interaction, which doesn't need to involve science and biology and measurement, but just something visually that is so beautiful. So firstly, I think it's important to go through this, like, why is it important to take action for nature? Often I find myself just assuming that it's the right thing to do, but I think our challenge is to move from the world of biology and ecology to sort of scale this and to get everyone to realize that nature is for everyone, that we need action at all levels, and also that conservation is not enough on its own. We have to find new ways to really transform society. So firstly, of course, science is telling us we need to act. There are so many reasons why this is clearly the right thing to do, and we are exceeding planetary boundaries. Nature can help prevent flooding, can provide us with the clean air, the clean soils, the water, pollination, all of these services. It's just the science is screaming out that this is an important thing to do. For us at universities, I think it's a really great opportunity to show leadership. We've got evidence that students are starting to look for universities that are leaders in this area, that are providing green spaces and, you know, commitments, ambitious commitments for climate and for nature. And it's also our chance. We have this unique position as universities in our communities to really cascade the science and the impact of what we're doing by sharing our journey. Risk and compliance, this is something that is coming. So whereas at the moment it is still largely voluntary, these things are in the pipeline. We will soon have to commit our science-based targets. We will have to be reporting on our impacts, our wider impacts, especially on things like deforestation. and our investments. So this is a chance to kind of be ahead of the curve. And then finally, I think the reason that speaks to me the most is just that nature gives our life colour and meaning, and there are so many well-being benefits to taking action for nature. So now I'm going to share some guidance which I didn't write myself, but I was involved with. But this comes from the EAUC, which is the Environmental Association of Universities and Colleges in the UK. And they did a kind of mapping, a little bit like Rebecca has done, but with slightly different lens, I guess, looking at how universities have embedded biodiversity into their action plans and strategies and wider sustainability strategies. And I found this really useful because it showed me that what we often focus on is the estates and operations of what is happening on our campuses, and to some extent the chance to show leadership and data collection and reporting. But actually these the sort of number 2 and number 4 in here, the teaching, learning and research, and also the partnerships and engagement, are clearly so important to get this sort of action taken that we need, and to really embed nature and biodiversity into our institutions in a way that isn't lost with staff turnover and students passing through. So just to go through a few of these, I probably won't read out all of them, but I encourage you to check out this link afterwards and see how you can use it for your institution. So things like including biodiversity in your sustainability strategy and in your senior leadership training. Also putting the structures in place to hold your university to account. And then finally, of course, signing the Nature Positive Pledge, we would love to invite you to do. Starting to think about including biodiversity in training for teaching staff, and thinking how biodiversity can be embedded into the curriculum, not just of ecology and geography and biology, but also into important subjects like business and finance, also communication, arts, design. These are the ones that really have superpower to sort of rethink our products and our services and the way we are working to have that better relationship with nature. In terms of the estates and operations, I think a lot of these are things that Rebecca has already mentioned, and I will mention a little bit later, but things like species management, creating habitats on site, sort of showcasing, highlighting the biodiversity things that are happening through signage, and also importantly, strengthening the responsible procurement initiatives. And then I think there's so many opportunities for engagement. So things like collaboration with local nature organisations, which is especially important for sometimes overlooked aspects like connectivity. So thinking about how your university can help create wildlife corridors with this, your surrounding city, and also with the neighbouring land. This is a really important thing. So think about these sort of green hearts of our cities that can help connect more widely for species that need to pass through. And then finally, the data collection and reporting. We think this is a really important way to show what you're doing and to hold yourself to account and to report publicly on your progress. So yeah, I would just encourage you. This is a kind of guide and also a template document for a biodiversity strategy, and I think it's a great piece of work. So just briefly to touch on the Nature Positive Pledge for anybody that is not familiar with it. This is our flexible framework that we encourage universities to commit to, and just to say, you don't have to have done these things before you pledge to join us. It's really recognizing that it's the start of your journey, and you may have done some work on baselines already, but you may not. And so the principle of the baseline is to set a point in time so that you can measure your biodiversity work and measure your progress quantitatively. So this could be looking at an area of campus, but it could also be looking at your supply chain impacts, just sort of some measure to record where you're starting from, to then set SMART targets. So these are targets that can be measured, that are time limited, specific targets. So that could be referring to specific species, or it could be about natural areas on campus as a percentage of your overall campus area. So it could be percentages of food sourced from certain locations. Next step is actions, which I will focus on a lot in the next slides, and then finally reporting. And just to say, we need to update the number. I think Katrin mentioned 135 institutions, so we now have 163. So a bit of a jump. The this is just a brief slide to mention that at NPU we will be offering some new services from 2026 onwards, which may be of interest to some of you. So we will be offering verification of the Nature Positive Pledge. We will also be offering a biodiversity footprinting pilot, sharing the techniques that University of Oxford researchers used when they measured the indirect impacts of University of Oxford's biodiversity impacts. And then finally, nature positive training, which can be at all levels. It could be aimed at students, but also at staff, which we also think is a really important aspect. So feel free to get in touch if you're interested in any of those, and we will be following up with more detailed information through our NPU mailing list. So this is a framework that I think is a really useful one to embed, even if you don't have a strategy or an action plan in place. I think it's a really useful framework that can be used at any scale. So that the principle is starting from refrain and reduce. So focusing on the things that are causing harm to biodiversity, and then working towards restoring and renewing biodiversity. So first, refraining from things such as chemical use or the most high impact foods, and then moving to reducing where it's not possible to stop those things, reducing where you can. So things like reducing mowing, or reducing the impacts of your laboratories, or managing invasive species. The next step being restore, so restoring areas of campus that may have become degraded, such as green walls or green roofs, where you have concrete and you have land that has been cleared. You can bring some biodiversity back in these ways. And rethinking our lawns. I think manicured green lawns of one species of grass is very common on our campus grounds, but starting to rethink that and thinking how we can create, like you've done at Berlin, these more inspiring, diverse, rich landscapes. And then finally, renew. This is kind of proactive effort to create new habitats and really think how we can go above and beyond to work towards that overall net positive impact on nature. So I will give a couple of examples now from our NPU network from each of those steps. So firstly, starting with refrain. This is two examples from the UK. So zero waste campus shop, I think, is a really crucial one. You might not think about this impacting biodiversity, but actually stopping waste production at the source and encouraging that sort of circular economy on campus is a really important step to stopping those indirect impacts that we're having. And this can also work for things like equipment and laboratories, where you're not buying new single-use plastic, but you're finding more circular systems and reused items. And then simple things like setting plant-based foods as default. We're not saying everybody should become vegan, but by just tweaking the defaults, you can have a lot more plant-based food, and you can reduce those impacts hugely without it being a problem, people feeling like they're losing their choices. Secondly, looking at reduce, these are two examples, especially trying to avoid collisions with species on campus. So in Canada, there are a lot of bird collisions happening, especially with tall glass, shiny buildings. And so there's some great examples from campus buildings that have been redesigned or retrofitted with designs on the glass, special shading and filters to help birds see those buildings and not collide. And then the other example is from University of Campinas in Brazil, where they've really worked to reduce the collisions with fauna on their campuses by signage and fencing and awareness campaigns. So then moving to restore. This is an amazing example from India, a government Dunga college, where they've really promoted the planting of native grassland species in a desert environment to restore land on the campus itself, but also on the villages and the surrounding area in Rajasthan, through massive kind of collaboration with local communities, with the police, with the army, with schools, and really using the university as a hub where these saplings are grown and nurtured, and then students and staff go out to distribute these saplings and help them be established and looked after. And then the other example in that slide is about mangrove restoration at Ajman University in the UAE, and this is also happening at KAUST in Saudi Arabia. I think universities have this amazing potential to be part of this important restoration work. And finally, I just wanted to share an example from Dawson College in Canada, where they set an institutional target of 1,000 species in 1,000 days on their urban campus, which is actually quite a challenging thing to achieve on a campus that doesn't have huge amounts of sort of natural space. But by setting this target and by setting up a map in the campus biodiversity network using iNaturalist, staff and students using citizen science could record the species, and they have actually met this target already, which is really, it's quite an achievement. And I think they had to get quite creative in creating new habitats such as dead wood and micro ponds to just try and bring in all kinds of species onto their campus. And so now I just want to give two themes that I think can be really useful to help people realize that nature is for everyone and to bring it out of this kind of ecology, biology focus. So firstly, finding the co-benefits of these solutions. I think well-being is something that speaks to a lot of people. By creating these kind of biodiverse, nature-rich places, they can be really beautiful places to spend time, and it's easier to see why it's such an important thing to do. And so this example from University of Cambridge, King's College, was the restoration of previously mown grass lawn, which I believe was mown for something like 300 years in the same way to this pristine design. And then over lockdown and beyond, this has now been restored to a hay meadow, and they found countless new plant species that hadn't been introduced suddenly popped up, but also bats and a big reduction in the heat island effect just by restoring a relatively small amount of land. And then this example from Peking University in China, designed by students to help the problem of flooding on campus, but also providing these attractive spaces to spend time. We're also providing more shade and interest. So I just think I think this is the way we have to think about creating nature and being part of nature, and really questioning that idea of people in nature, people and nature, people affecting nature. So finally, I just want to move on to that idea of finding champions for nature at all levels. And so this diagram in the middle, we often think at NPU, we think about our impacts in terms of what's happening on site, that being how your land is managed and what you have, in your campus surrounding, which I guess a lot of the things Rebecca talked about are especially focused on these site-based impacts. But then, as we found with the biodiversity footprinting work at University of Oxford, we found just like scope 3 for carbon, so many of our impacts are actually in this upstream supply chains, sort of indirect impacts on nature that are happening all over the world related to the products that we are buying, the resources that we are using. Then the next stage being the teaching and influence. And this one is a little bit harder to measure, but obviously so important, and really what the sort of superpower that universities have to reach the whole of society, and to change the students that are going through, and this sort of ripple effect to achieve these kind of global nature positive outcomes. And so I've just put around that circle, I've put the kind of people and jobs that I think can be involved. And really you can see that it is so much of a university, so many different kinds of roles have a role to play. And there's probably some, you may think some are in the wrong category. I think many of them will be contributing to that overall dark green circle. And I just wanted to put a shout out to the Trinity College Dublin, who have created the position of Pro Vice Chancellor for Biodiversity and Climate, which I think is a great thing to do, to have such a senior management position with biodiversity in the title. And so finally, yeah, I'm just going to illustrate a few of these from our NPU network, just because even though we're talking about biodiversity and ecosystems, it's actually people that we need to change, and our relationship and our activities and our roles to actually make this change that we need to happen. So starting from the top, this gardener is at the Said Business School in Oxford, and he has used his role, which is importantly to keep, to maintain a campus and a place for visiting students and courses, but he has taken that role to actually be a wildlife gardener at the same time. So as well as having kind of pristine planted plots with flowers and looking attractive, there's also a lot of space that he has created for ponds with frogs and deer and hedgehogs and all kinds of wildlife that's also there. The librarian, this was a kind of surprise to me, but it's super important. This is a librarian in Laurentian who has taken on the nature positive theme to have books and resources highlighted to students that may be visiting the library for another purpose, but it's just a chance to, to bring these new resources to people. The next one at the top, the finance academic, this is from University of Cambridge, and she's looking at the impact of the banking that the university, the banking provider, in this case, Barclays, that the University of Cambridge bank with, and saying that, because this is the largest investor in fossil fuels in Europe, that actually the university should question that relationship. And so she's building a coalition of universities looking to change their bank to ones that actually prioritize nature and biodiversity. And then in the middle, we have this landscape architect who may be even on the call from Campinas in Brazil. We have construction and building design being important ways to think about our buildings in terms of bird collisions. We have procurement, which is such an important area to think about how we can change the categories and change the tender documents and change how we relate with our suppliers to start to realize where the products are coming from and what those impacts might be. Quite often the data is just not there when you get a procurement order. It may just be amount of spend in IT equipment. It might not be specifically this number of laptops which were sourced from these locations, which is the kind of data that we need to be able to work out what those impacts are. Lab managers, actually for Oxford, it's a really important one because we have something like 1,000 labs, and this is the largest part of our indirect biodiversity footprint. So getting lab managers on board to start thinking of more creative, smart ways to be carrying out our science is a really important one. And then students at the bottom, I think these are actually, a huge part of the solution to call for more ambitious targets and actions to bring nature to their fellow students and just always calling for more. So I think students are actually really the key here. And just a shout out to invite universities in this network to apply for our student ambassadors program. So that will be launching in August, ready for an October start, and that's open to students, any students in any higher education institution around the world, not limited to universities that have pledged. And that's a kind of peer-to-peer monthly green skills workshops where students connect with other students and find out about how to take action for nature on their campus and kind of share their journeys together. And we found that to be really rewarding for the students involved. And then finally, I think I've already mentioned the Pro Vice Chancellor at Trinity College Dublin, the domestic bursar. This is an example from Oxford where this bursar is really prioritising food impacts. So he commissioned a study looking at the impacts of their food and then tweaking their menus to avoid the highest impact items, even though they were things like coffee and chocolate, which is obviously not very popular, but by little tweaks, you can have a huge impact on biodiversity impacts. So I think I'm going to finish there. Thank you so much. I guess my overriding message is that every job can be a green job and that we need actions at all levels and that just conservation isn't enough. We need to reach, cascading through and universities are a great way to do that. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Emily, for this fantastic presentation. And thank you also to both of you for really showing us the scope of biodiversity strategies, both in terms of content as well as in terms of stakeholders behind such strategies. And we are now opening up for questions, and you're welcome to use either the chat or your hand raise function, and I try to monitor that. But as we are over 40 participants, please also just help me if I should overlook anyone. At this point in time, I don't see any questions, so let me be so blunt and start off with one of my own. So you both have stated, and you framed it as a superpower of universities, Emily, to cause this kind of ripple effect among stakeholders and what to reach with the biodiversity strategy. And I would be interested to hear from both of you what kind of surprised you most when looking into biodiversity strategies. So what kind of spin-over effects, ideas that were created while establishing a strategy really surprised you? So who would like to start? Rebecca, do you want to go first?
I'm still thinking. The most surprised I was when I read in the strategy practices how to support fungi and lichens. And because I'm from a fungi lab, I was pretty excited about that. But I'm trying to think about something more general as well.
Okay, Emily, does anything come to mind?
I think for me, maybe it's just the potential for well-being. I think often nature on university campuses, people think of nature in terms of well-being and think about creating spaces for people to relax and to spend time without thinking how much biodiversity is there, how can we measure it? And so I think understanding that kind of relationship that people have with nature or in nature, I think is a really key to kind of unlocking this and to make it speak to everyone. And I think it's something I hadn't properly recognized. So I'm just kind of feel like on a mission to bring biodiversity out of the biology department where I sit to try and yeah, just find that relevance for everyone.
Excellent, yeah, thank you for this account. And we have our first question from Liam from the University of Strathclyde.
Excuse me. Hi there. Hope you can hear me okay. Yep. Firstly, thank you. Fantastic presentations, both really interesting, lots of great takeaways. So thank you for that. Thank you both. I was just wondering if as part of any of your work and research, did you come across any particularly useful funding models? I think we all know that obviously when we come to some of these initiatives, which we love to do, funding is always one of the challenges. And I'm just wondering if there was anything that particularly stood out when you were looking at what universities are doing across Europe and beyond, particularly thinking around maybe private-public partnerships, which is something we're keen to kind of explore, engaging local businesses and getting that kind of support locally and hopefully replicating benefits. So yeah, just curious if there's anything you came across as part of your research that stood out as good ways to fund some of this great work. Thank you.
Rebecca, Emily. Yeah, Emily.
Yeah, I'm kind of scratching my head a little bit. It's definitely like a super important question. I guess I mean, ways to get the actual work done. I think there's such a potential for students to actually be involved with the surveying and sort of measuring what's there and being involved with restoration. But I know you do actually often need hard cash, so I think that isn't really answering your question. So yeah, maybe I'll just think for a little minute. I don't know if Rebecca's got any ideas that come to mind, and then I'll come back after that.
Very, very similar answer. I have not come across many financing plans when I looked across the biodiversity strategies. There's a lot of reliance on either teaching or voluntarily work.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we're certainly looking to engage volunteers and students for all of this as well, but it's just useful to have a bit of backup money as well. But thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is starting to move into something that universities will have to consider. I mean, at Oxford, we just commissioned we have some new legislation in the UK, you would know, biodiversity net gain. But this is where all new building developments have to demonstrate that they will be providing 10% additional biodiversity when they do a building project. And as part of that, we commissioned a study also looking at carbon sequestration potential for our estate, combined with a climate resilience kind of mapping for 2050. And really you start to see the kind of win-win, that it starts to make sense for your staff to have kind of cool enough working environments. If you look to 2050 in the UK, where we will have much drier, hotter summers and much wetter winters, then to start thinking of providing these sort of resilient ecosystems on campus that we need to provide, comfortable working situations, and also to think of combining nature and carbon in terms of our net zero carbon commitments. That's going to be expensive, that kind of offsetting. So if we can start to think about how we can combine that by joining together nature and carbon, yeah, I'm not sure that's an answer, but I think it's starting to become of more kind of strategic significance for universities.
Yes, I would also see the same in Germany, that it's more also added in the compliance field when it comes to building regulations, and so that we also try to be in touch with our utilities department to include that in tenders, for example, when restoring buildings. And then one thing Rebecca forgot to mention maybe is that she was very successful in award competitions, sometimes with prize money. It's not a lot of money, it's a lot of work, but that was something that she was also successfully doing. So we have a next question from Laura Becci.
Okay, oops, sorry. Okay, so it's just, it's not really a question, it's just to comment on what Liam asked about fundings for a biodiversity project. It's just to give an example or share an experience that we hope to implement at the European University Institute in Florence. We are based in Italy, and we actually, for the first time, we are trying to get access to public funds, because at the European level, I'm talking about European level, of course, I don't know in a different context, there are a lot of funds that are accessible for biodiversity projects to encourage, for example, let's say the short chain production or to promote the conservation of the ecosystem, the agriculture. So for example, we are trying to transform the little community garden that we had managed by our students based on a voluntary experience into a micro farm in cooperation with some local farmers. And to do this, of course, we needed money, and we are working on a competition at the local regional level to access special funds to be concentrated on this project, and whose main aim is also the community engagement, the integration with the local geographical context, the didactical and pedagogical aspect, collaborating with schools. So maybe there are other countries where you can have a look at what is available as public funds and maybe create partnerships with local farmers and create an example also of a living lab, which is something that I, just going back to the presentation, which is something that I personally strongly encourage as a, because otherwise, I mean, the university is a unique, gives a unique context and framework for making, for research, for experimenting, for also creating a culture, a shared culture. So this is really, I don't know if it might work in other contexts, in other countries, I don't know, but we are, for the first time, we are exploring this possibility. We are now working on this competition, and we hope we can, we will be able to be among those who will get the funds, because it's going to be very interesting. And that's just an idea. But just to give you the size of our campus, we have 25 hectares of green areas. So we have a lot of biodiversity, and in most cases it's historical gardens. So that's a problem also with the listed, so we cannot do a lot, but we have several projects. We don't have a strategy though. We are building a strategy, because we have the things, we have the actions, but we don't have the strategy. So we're doing the other way around, just to share our experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for sharing, Victoria.
Emily, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the procurement supply chain side of things. Often when I'm talking to our members, people sort of have a reaction of, oh, we're an urban campus, we don't have a lot of green space, we don't really have biodiversity on campus. But then when I talk to them about, well, what about in the supply chain and that bigger purchasing sort of piece that you have, increasingly our members, of course, are trying to get their minds around Scope 3 emissions. So how much overlap is there, as they're already doing mapping and work on the Scope 3 side of things for climate? How can we leverage that work to inform your biodiversity procurement work?
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I would say if you are already looking at scope 3 for carbon, then you're halfway there. Like that is the same data that you need. It's that those records of the activities that are going on. So I guess where possible, the tweaks that make it easier to carry out a biodiversity footprint is thinking of that data not just in spend data if possible. So where it's possible to actually get quantities of for example, food purchased or like kilometers of miles traveled for your travel, where it's possible to get that kind of data through surveys or through working closely with. Sometimes it's just a question of the procurement staff recording the data in a different way. So those numbers would have been known when the orders were made, but sometimes it's just not put into the system with all of that data. So you kind of lost it. But having that, so especially for food, having that quantity data means you can then turn it into life cycle impact. So that's really the process, is that first set of collecting the data of the things that are going on, procurement data, which can be spend-based, that is fine, and then turning it into life cycle impact data, which there are several tools to do that. And if you have academics that are interested, then it's a great way to work with them. And then with the sort of optional step of turning those environmental impacts, which are things like land use and emissions to water, emissions to air, some of the things that are missed when you just look for carbon, turning those impacts into a kind of proxy measure for biodiversity. So even though it's not ideal to turn biodiversity impacts into one unit, it's not that we advocate that, but it can be a useful way to kind of look for your hotspots. So yeah, we would love to work with you, Victoria. Maybe we can with ISCN to take this forward together collectively.
Thank you, Emily. There's another question from Annette.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. It was really nice. I'm curious, in terms of communicating, a lot of what you're describing overlaps also with the climate change initiatives, but also their strategy. So how do you communicate that to stakeholders? So we look at the scope 3 emissions for climate, but we also do it for biodiversity, who's responsible, who's accountable, and so on. Thank you.
Should I answer? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, personally, I think it's a great opportunity to do it together. I don't think it makes sense to replicate. And also in terms of staffing, a lot of universities are feeling it, it's a difficult time at the moment, and some staff staff cuts and resources are feeling kind of pinched. So I think if you have somebody that is responsible for carbon data, then that is a great person to start thinking about biodiversity data. And also just to, I think often in sustainability strategies, it is already kind of mixed together. And I don't think there's a right way. Some people prefer to have a biodiversity action plan separate than their sustainability or their climate action plan. But personally, I think it's a great opportunity to do it together because so many of the things are so connected, and it makes sense to kind of upskill or to retrain the staff working in that area, just to kind of include both of those aspects. And I think you will find so many kind of overlaps and complementary approaches that way.
Rebecca, do you want to add something, or shall I move on?
No, I think it's interesting to see where these scopes overlap and where there are specialties to, let's say, biodiversity or climate change. But yes, it's of course makes sense to have both in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess for me, just recognizing the specialism of biodiversity, there's a handful of biodiversity managers now at universities, which is really great to see. But we recognize not all universities by any stretch have the capacity or resources to have those positions in place. And so I think we need to work with, what we've got and make it relevant for everybody.
Okay. Simon.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the interesting presentations. It's kind of a follow-up to Victoria before. So I think, Emily, you mentioned there are many tools to assess the biodiversity footprints. Like, do you have any resources on the NPU website or so where we could check this up? Or is there something like a greenhouse gas protocol for biodiversity, or just a go-to place? And then maybe also on the side, you mentioned something like a newsletter, but I wasn't able to find a sign up link. So if you could share this in the chat, that would be great.
Yeah, in terms of a tool, there's sadly not a kind of plug and play ready tool yet, but we are working on it. We're working on guidance, and we will be launching a kind of community of practice of people working towards this next year. But there are approaches. The University of Oxford study was published in a Nature paper with lots of supplementary information. So if you have capacity to engage with a kind of huge report and lots of data and stuff, like it's all there, but we are currently working to turn it into more usable guidance, and in collaboration with some Finnish universities which have also used the same approach, University of Jyväskylä. And sorry, yeah, our mailing list, if you look at the contact us, it's a good prompt that we need to tweak our website to make it easier to join. If you look at the contact us page, then that has a box to tick to join our mailing list.
Thank you. Dima also has a question.
Hi.
I can hear you.
Sorry, I just couldn't hear you.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the Student Ambassador Program, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about what it will entail and how involved it can be.
Sure. So the way it ran last year is we have monthly workshops. So students sign up directly to us through the NPU website. The forms will be open from August. And basically everybody is welcome. We don't distinguish between like subjects or background or location. So we had around 500 students last year from all over the globe, probably mostly global South students, but very wide range of backgrounds. And the way it works is we have monthly workshops on a different topic. So the first one we had was, what is nature positive? And then we had what is a biodiversity baseline and how can I be involved in working on that? And then we had biodiversity actions. And then we had sustainable food and circular economy, and then how to use my advocacy. So sort of 6-hour-long workshops, interactive workshops, supported by toolkits with more information and a workbook where students kind of record what they've been doing. And then if they complete that program, which can either be attending live or watching back, then at the end of the year, they will get a certificate. And where possible, we connect those students with their university staff, but we run it as a sort of direct connection with the students because that's not always possible and there's not always staff that can support them. But where possible, like the ideal is to have a kind of university committed, giving opportunities to work with its strategy and with its like university-wide actions. So yeah, if you're interested, please do get in touch. We would love to kind of cascade it to universities that haven't heard about it already.
Excellent. Thank you for the invitation, Emily. So if there are no more questions, we are also coming to an end of our 1 hour together. And I would like to very much thank you, Emily and Rebecca, for your presentations and also for the discussion. And of course, everyone who joined us today for this joint session. And yeah, Victoria, over to you.
Great. Yeah, no, just to echo that, thank you so much to Katrin, Emily, and Rebecca. Great presentations, really great conversation. I agree, we should be thinking about more ways that ISCN and NPU can continue to collaborate. I'm excited to see some of the new services, Emily, that you have for 2026 that NPU is coming out with some more discussion on that. But yeah, thank you for joining us today. We will make the presentations and session recording available after this meeting. So with that, wish you a good rest of your day or evening, and thank you again for joining us.